The UK Guardian reports that the UK faces reckoning after unmarked Indigenous graves discovered in Canada. The news comes after activists call on Britain to acknowledge its role in efforts to erase Indigenous culture. The United Kingdom is facing growing calls to re-examine the troubling legacy of its colonial history in Canada after the discovery of more than 1,000 unmarked graves at former residential schools for Indigenous children. At least 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend such church-run schools as part of the campaign to strip them of their cultural identity. And amid anger over Catholic Church's role in operating the institutions, churches across the country have been set on fire. But activists have also pointed the finger at Canada's colonial ruler, demanding greater recognition of the British Empire's role in establishing policies that aimed to erase Indigenous culture, and a system whose effects are still felt today. Last week, protesters toppled statues Queen Victoria and Elizabeth II, and another of the explorer James Cook was hurled into the sea. The wresting of lands away from Indigenous peoples was permissible because it was done in the name of the British Empire, said Sean Carlton, a professor of Canadian and Indigenous history at the University of Manitoba. And so statues and street names in the country have been targeted because they are symbols of that legitimacy. Countries that enslave people and dispossessed Indigenous nations have in recent years been forced to reassess legacy figures once held up as national heroes. In the United States, more than 100 statues have been removed of Confederate generals and explorers such as Christopher Columbus. In the United Kingdom, statues of the slave traders Edward Colston and Robert Milligan have been torn down.
Ripped to the ground in just seconds. This was an historic moment.
The history of empire making was connected around the globe in different ways, says Carlton, pointing to similarly brutal strategies of violence and discussions used by colonial powers. But the unmaking of empire is also a similarly connected global phenomenon. In Belgium, a statue of King Leopold II was recently defaced and then removed. Australia, Barbados, Chile, and Colombia have seen similar pushes to tear down colonial figures. The movement has now reached Canada. This is part of a broader push by Indigenous peoples who experience similar types of erasure by the Crown and colonial powers for liberation.
Between the 1870s and 1990s, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families. They were made to attend church-run boarding schools. There, they were forced to abandon their native languages and convert to Christianity. Thousands died of disease and malnourishment. Some took their own lives. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission called it cultural genocide.